Okay, so what I'd like to share about your initial looking at Warhol's work. We're all pretty familiar with Warhol as an individual and some of his more famous pieces, as Jordan was saying. People are more familiar with his iconic imagery of famous people like Marilyn Monroe or Michael Jackson or Elvis, or his repurposing of common imagery like the Brillo pads or bananas or soup cans. And so what I think we all are familiar with in terms of what Andy Warhol has to offer is this idea of a fleeting moment, of what's popular, pop art, popular culture. And so deciding what in that moment is popular and what he wants to preserve or elevate in a different way. Something as simple as a Campbell soup can has now been elevated because of his repurposing of the artwork. So when we look at this artwork, this is quite a bit different than his normal style or his normal series. This was his last major series that he did before he passed away. And it's different in a lot of ways from a lot of his work. First of all, the color is a little bit different because although to the average viewer, Andy Warhol probably kind of randomly chose color, he did choose color with intention, but it had a lot more to do with aesthetics and grouping, especially when he was doing portraits of people or objects that he put in repetitious fashion, in repetition together. The color choices in this particular piece of work are very important because they really denote a lot of imagery and communication about the individuals. We'll talk a little bit more about that, but I just want to point out that when you're paying attention to the colors that you're seeing, to really note that they're done with intention. The other thing that's different about this group of work from his other work is he did more trial proofs for this series than are in the series, which he had never done before. So there are 14 trial proofs. There were 4 images that didn't make the final cut for this series. And I think that really demonstrates just how understanding Warhol was of what this imagery means in context together, and that a different number of images or even the wrong balance of images might not convey the message he's trying to send about, it's titled Cowboys and Indians, and we're talking about kind of this mythical, romanticized version of the West. And I think that he was very careful to curate those 10 pieces. He had never done that before. Usually when he made his trial proofs of trying to figure out color and things, those images that he made in those trial proofs were what was out in the series. And then lastly, the thing of note that is very different in this work from his other work is this is the first time in a series, first and only time in a series, where he combines portraiture and objects. We're familiar with his portraiture and his objects and being featured separately, usually only portraits or only objects. And in this particular case, he's featuring portraiture and objects together. And I think that is an interesting note or side piece for you to realize, because it means that everything was very, very intentional. There's not a color or a line or an object or an image that isn't really meant to be a part of the conversation here tonight.
Something that's really great too, like we were saying, how he's continually challenging who's a hero or who's the villain. Something that's really interesting about this series is he features Sitting Bull and also Geronimo. And when we are revisiting those dime novels or those Westerns, it's always the Sioux, the Apache, the Comanche, and the Pawnee that are continually our villains. But here we have Warhol featuring these 2 men and really questioning, okay, so they might have been villains in the eyes of these romanticized Westerns, but they were very much heroes to their people, right? Because it wasn't like they were these bloodthirsty individuals. They were 2 men that were saying, we can't let this happen to our people. We love our people so much that we're going to defend our territory until we cannot anymore. And also, just because of boundaries and the secession of the United States, it didn't necessarily mean that these tribes were more hostile. These tribes primarily were some of the last that remained in what was designated Indian territory. So they were watching their land getting smaller and smaller and smaller from all angles of the United States, and it wasn't that they were the last ones to hold out. That's just how we have the establishment of the East Coast and then the gold rush on the West Coast. They were primarily in the Great Plains and southern areas, so it wasn't, again, like they were holding out and they were the most hostile and they hated the United States. They just were some of the last tribes that fell within that Indian territory, so it would make sense that they were the last to be placed on reservations. Something else that's really great about this is he features the Indian head buffalo nickel. And when you are researching the Indian head buffalo nickel, it was originally minted in the earlier 1900s, and it was minted on behalf of the United States. The president asked if we could have more art in our currency. And so he asked several designated artists to think of something that makes the United States the United States. And the artist that was chosen to use his imagery on this currency said, I picked the American Indian and I picked the bison because I knew if anyone saw this currency, they would know it belongs to the United States, because nothing is more American than the American Indian and the American bison.
I think also this idea of the hero and the villain, we're talking about subjective versus objective. One of the things that, Andy Warhol didn't do a lot of commentary on his work. He really left it up to the audience and art criticism to decide what they think it means. But I think it's very visually representative here in the style of portraits that he chose and the objects that he chose to represent each group. So when we look at the kind of portraits, a lot of the portraits featuring American Indian people are very head-on without much going on around them. And this is more of a documentation style, right? It's more of a featuring a person as an object, as we were kind of discussing with photographs earlier. Whereas these kind of heroes, even including Annie Oakley, this was a big deal because we often associate cowboys and the American West as a very masculine thing. So all of these features of these other people, their gaze isn't quite center. And this gives the illusion that they exist outside of this portrait because there's something else. It breaks the boundary of the portrait. And so it's giving them more humanistic qualities by giving them the opportunity to exist outside of this portrait. Whereas for the most part, these are pretty straight on, and the objects featured are very much object-oriented, which is still this documentation style. So I think that is a little bit of a commentary on the quote-unquote disappearing race that we've been talking about, and this idea that the American West really had the frontier of cowboys and this kind of disappearing idea of Native people. And so having to document that in that style, I think, is really important. So Warhol got his images from popularized culture, right? These are pretty famous portraits of these people. But this particular image, it's called Mother and Child, has often been referred to as the Madonna of Native culture, of that mother and child aspect. And there's a lot of kind of feminist qualities in terms of the pink being really soft, but also a lot of strength in the contrasting colors of the red and the green. And this particular image, he bought at an auction a set of photographs of Native American people, and he came across this photograph by happenstance. So I think it's really interesting that this particular curated, I was talking about how specific he was with the imagery that was included. I think it's very interesting to add, again, that kind of matronly or feminist aspect to the American West that we often associate with masculinity, which is also something that has happened here with Annie Oakley being featured. The other thing that I want to say, when I was talking about Andy Warhol really capturing the fleeting moment of what was popular, I don't think that when he made this, he could have foreseen the longevity of how relevant this work would be far into the future. because he really considered himself to be capturing a moment in time. Famously, he coined the phrase that everyone will have 15 minutes of fame, this kind of idea of a fleeting moment. And I don't think that he could have anticipated that these images, while popular in the 80s and with the group of people, his audience at the time, are images that were well established hundreds of years before he made this series and are still a part of the contemporary conversation today. I think that most of his work exists in the moment that he made it, and we view it with that reverence of looking back as that moment in time. But these kind of have a little bit more longevity, and I don't think he could have anticipated that. And I wonder what he would think about this being featured and it still being a contemporary and relative conversation. Go ahead.
Oh, no, I was just going to say, and again, you will have time to walk around after our lecture. If you feel like you didn't get enough Warhol time, you'll have time to do that as well. But I think we're going to move on. Is that what you were going to say?
I was going to say that.
Nailed it.
Yep.
Let's go. Let's go.
So there is some Billy Shank work featured on the wall here. You're welcome to look at that really quickly. We're going to move out into this open area where more of his work is featured, and we will talk a little bit about his work in relevance to Andy Warhol. So just a kind of a little bit of commentary on Billy Shank and his relationship to Andy Warhol and his style of work. Billy Shank very much took inspiration from and was in kind of connection with and in the same era as Andy Warhol. And he took a lot of inspiration from this style of taking popularized culture and images and stripping them down, flattening them, reinterpreting them, and representing them to the audience for us to kind of look at our relationship with what we believe to be the American West. And he heavily featured in the start of his career movie stills from Westerns, which we will talk about as we move around here. One of the things that is a little bit different where his work diverges from Warhol is that his body of work is focused on this idea as opposed to the single series that Andy Warhol did. So his body of work is focused on interpreting and analyzing and viewing what the West is comprised of and what it means to be in the American West. And he even went as far as to move out of New York City and submerge himself in the culture and the images and the ideas that he was portraying. And he eventually moved away from using movie stills and using his own photographic references to make images. This work that you're seeing here is more focused on movie stills and that kind of beginning of his career with looking how American Indian people and the cowboy and Western films really influenced culture and influenced their idea of what the West is and how it's been romanticized. But his work and his style over time changed a little bit in moving away from this kind of popularized idea to his own work. And so that is kind of compared to when we think of Remington and his work of Western art, and he painted it from afar, not experiencing it, versus Charlie Russell. I was going to say Charlie, and then I was like, I don't actually know him.
We're not friends with him. We can't call him Charlie.
Pay more respect. Charlie Russell lived in and experienced and did his due diligence to really immerse himself in the situation. So that is similar with Billy Shank. He really immersed himself. He even became a bareback rider and a saddle bronc rider and lived in Wyoming and Arizona and really immersed himself in what he believed to be the contemporary American West.
Yeah, and what's excellent about him too is that he's watching these films that the rest of the country is watching, and he starts to question things like, wait, what? Is that really how it is? And so his humor is displayed throughout a lot of his pieces. Some of his pieces you will see come with his own captions on them, and I think that's really great. He also seems just like a funny person that I wish I could be friends with. He really emulates the over dramatization that we see so often in the Western films. No one has it rougher than the cowboys. No one's more upset than the women in the films, right? And he does the same thing he expands on the concept of what we were talking about as far as sexualizing American Indian people. He saw that, he recognized that, he recognized how American Indian women are dressed in film a lot of times, how they're treated as objects. And so you will see a couple of pieces of his work where he's like, we'll just make them naked, right? And that's his commentary, that's his reflection saying, how far are we going to really take this? How far out of reality are we really going to take the audience? Is that really necessary? So I just want to draw your attention to this piece here, and we'll view it too when we go down the stairs to check out Frank Buffalo Hyde's work. But this is really, really common in Westerns, and it features Monument Valley as the backdrop. And what's so funny about Western film is that Monument Valley was the hot spot for everyone to shoot a Western, right? It's obviously located very much south of us, but at the beginning of these films, it would say Montana, or it would say Arizona, or it would say California, or Idaho, or Oregon, all in the same obscure place, right? But that's also setting the scene of this vast open land. No one else was there, nothing else was going on. It was literally the open Wild West, and settlers needed to go there. They needed to be there because it was just this vast unoccupied land. So I love that he uses Monument Valley as one of his backdrops. Downstairs? You want to talk about some over here?
I think let's move around this way. We'll look at a couple more pieces, and then we'll move downstairs.
You can feel the drama in this one, right? How forlorn is this woman?
Yeah, and I think that, excuse me, these pieces here kind of demonstrate some of the points that we're making, where from an artistic standpoint, Schenck was really using these mass-producing styles of work without actually mass-producing. So we have images like this, where we have the offsets prints from like black and white photos. When you enlarge them, you get those dots, and so that offset color. And this happens when you're blowing up an image and reproducing it, and it kind of degrades over time. But this work is not mass produced, right? It's very specific, it's on canvas, and he's using this style to emphasize his point of this mass-produced in media and in Hollywood, this idea and this imagery of the West. I also wanted to, we came over here because this one demonstrates that dramatization point. I also think that this area demonstrates kind of this, this scene of where we see a lot of desertness for the American West. And I don't know if you've been outside lately. Doesn't really feel like a desert out here, right? And so this misconception and this set of imagery that's pushed out to the public and what their view is. So if you grow up on one of the coasts, for example, you never come to the Midwest for any reason, your idea of what the landscape might be here is this kind of dry and barren and harsh environment. And how did the cowboys survive there? And how did the Native American people survive there for so long in this harsh environment? Not really attributing any like resource looking or the intelligence or knowledge of people to move around and find resources that are livable, right? All right, so we're going to, you can certainly make your way around the gallery if you would like on our way downstairs. We're going to go down and talk about Frank Buffalo Hyde before we open it up for questions or conversation. We originally, obviously it wasn't advertised that we were adding Frank Buffalo Hyde, but when we were here on Friday and viewing his work, it really contributes to the conversation we've been having about these pieces upstairs. So I hope you'll bear with us as we move downstairs to view his work. So as we conclude our evening with Frank Buffalo Hyde, I think it's very fitting to look around at his work and see the same conversation we're having from an Indigenous perspective. Frank Buffalo Hyde is an Indigenous artist, and he is quoted for saying, "I don't need permission to make the work that I make. Never have, and no artist should." And I think this is really important because we're in a weird contemporary issue for American Indian people, American Indian artists specifically, where the definition of American Indian art is very open to interpretation, and it should be up to American Indian people, American Indian artists, to define what is American Indian art. Inherently, an American Indian person makes art, therefore the art is American Indian art. However, American Indian artists are kind of finding themselves in this weird position where if their artwork doesn't use visibly recognizable Native imagery, they're having a hard time with their work being recognized as Indigenous work. And so I like that Frank Buffalo Hyde says, I don't need permission to make what I'm making, I just make what I want to make, essentially. And his work is kind of indicative of the styles that we've been seeing upstairs, where he's taking imagery that is contemporary in nature of the American Indian experience and making commentary by manipulating the images and having a painterly style over these images and redistributing what you see back to the audience to have a conversation. Another thing that I think is great about his work to really to participate in that conversation piece is all of his pieces, as you were walking around, have a little bit more of a description than just a title to give you a little bit more understanding of the direction he's going and the conversation he wants to have with the viewer based on the artwork he's made.
Yeah, and what's funny about that too is how we began our evening as we looked at those portraits when you Google search Native American and what they look like and what pops up. And another piece of his artwork, especially through this series, is he has commentary surrounding the fact of they're also, even today, because it's so romanticized and the mythology is so great, we see it every year. What do people from all over the world come to in March? Western Art Week, right? We have people all over the world who want to see this type of work. This same idea that the American Indian is either completely vanished or on their way out. And so what's really funny about his artwork is he really takes a technology standpoint. So you'll notice that in some of his featured pieces, you'll see the cell phones and this idea of, well, we must witness culture. We have to record this now instead of just being in the moment. We need to record this now because we might never see it again. We might not ever have the chance to see that again because this race might not be here anymore. So.
Yeah, indicative, I mean, he's titled this eyewitness culture, kind of a play on words to Apple products and having an eye in front of that, and the technology that's involved in our day-to-day lives. So I think that this is a fitting way to end our walking tour together because this is the most contemporary example of the conversation we've been having with the other two artists as well. But we thank you so much for your time with us this evening, and we hope that this was informative for you.